which sits in what is now called Elizabeth Tower, one of the buildings already honouring the late Queen, obviously from while she was still alive.
Yes, really, it's hard that you can't give the Queen medals and jewels. She's got them all. So you have to think of new ways to honour her. And, you know, to name Big Ben's Tower in her name is a great thing. And, you know, these are the things that will remain down the centuries ahead to remind us of a Queen who is now departed.
You're hearing some tolling every minute. That is not Big Ben. That is the bell in Westminster Abbey, and I can tell you it's tolling 96 times before the funeral starts to mark the 96 years that the Queen served. Maybe let's look at the span of history of those 7 decades, because she is now the Queen of 15 countries, as well as the head of the Commonwealth. When she took the throne, she was the Queen in 32 countries, and people around the world might not even be aware that she was the Queen in countries like Nigeria. She was the Queen in Pakistan for the first 4 years of her reign, and to add to that, of course, Pakistan, what was then Pakistan, because of a bloody war in the 1970s, split, is also Bangladesh as well. Quite remarkable how the war has changed. And also the fact that when she took the throne in 1952, everyone remembered World War II. It was just a few years earlier.
Yes. She was, in a way, an empress. She wasn't an empress with a crown on her head in this case, because the countries of the Commonwealth, which were associated with Britain after the Second World War, had their own independence. But nonetheless, she was their guiding force. And she remained, the Commonwealth was an absolute #1 priority as far as the Queen was concerned, to keep this body of nations together. And something which she managed to achieve, although as time goes on, history changes. And you have to accept that other nations have different ideas about which way their destiny lies.
We see the congregation there, and a moment ago, the picture of President Joe Biden and his wife, the First Lady, Jill. They are waiting for the start of the service. Let's tell you what we're expecting in the next 45 minutes or so, because these things have been planned for decades, but they are planned to the absolute minute. We're going to see at about 35 minutes past the hour, about 25 minutes from now, the bearer party, which is going to go into Westminster Hall. Now, Westminster Hall is that medieval hall that we've seen so much of in recent days, because it's where the coffin has been lying on the catafalque, and literally thousands and thousands of people have queued on that very, very long queue through London to pay their respects to the Queen. The coffin will then be put onto the state gun carriage. The state gun carriage will then be pulled by naval ratings to the Abbey. It's not a very long distance, but that pulling is part of the history of this, and it comes, I think, Christopher, from a bit of a mistake in the past.
Well, yes. At Queen Victoria's funeral, the horses of the Household Cavalry were dragging the gun carriage with Queen Victoria on, and the traces broke, and there was a tremendous row between the man who's in charge of the soldiers when a palace official came along and said, "Can you get this fixed?" And he said, "Well, yes, of course we're getting it fixed." But finally, somebody came up with a bright idea, because they didn't want to delay the procedure of getting the sailors who were lining the route to form up in a line, and because they're sailors, they've got rope and they were able to attach it. And so a whole new tradition started of sailors pulling the gun carriage to its final resting place. And that's how tradition is made.
Now we're seeing, among the dignitaries arriving, the First Ministers of Scotland and Wales. This is a United Kingdom made up of 4 different nations, and they are clearly represented here. First Minister of Wales, of course, a sign of the previous job that the new king had as Prince of Wales, the longest-serving Prince of Wales. For 64 years he served in that job, and no one has done that job for as long as that. Give me your reflection on what it will be like for the king. I mean, we don't know, do we? But what it will be like for the king today. I mean, he's performed in the spotlight for the last 10 days while grieving his mother.
I think the performance that King Charles has given in these last days has been absolutely remarkable. I think the one thing that stays with me, I think you were outside Buckingham Palace, when he arrived at Buckingham Palace on the first occasion when he came down from Scotland, his duty was to go and meet his Prime Minister and shake her by the hand and say, we are now the team. Instead of which, he went out and spent a good 10 or 15 minutes pressing the flesh, meeting the people, just ordinary people standing there, hoping that they would get a sight of him. And this has been repeated again subsequently. I thought I was very touched to see that he went out to the vast queue of people waiting to come into Westminster Hall and went again and thanked them for coming. This is a very different Prince Charles, well, King Charles, that we saw from Prince Charles. He's very much closer to the people now, I think, than he has been before.
And of course, if you are starting something like a royal reign, the first impression really matters. We see the man who until a very short time ago was the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, arriving with his wife. Of course, the very last act of the Queen was that transfer. She did it in Balmoral, which is not the normal place, but that transfer of Prime Ministers. And we're going to see, I think, all of the former Prime Ministers. There are 6 currently alive in the UK, which I think is a record number of Prime Ministers who are still alive. All 6 are now making their way into the Abbey. Adrian.
James Space there in London. Our correspondents around the world are preparing to tell us about how the rest of the world is viewing what's going on in London today. We have Sarah Clark in Sydney and Haru Matassa in Johannesburg. But first, let's head to India. Pavni Mittal is in New Delhi for us. Pavni, as the United Kingdom mourns its queen, how is she being remembered there in India?
Now, for many people in India, particularly the younger generation, she is, of course, the monarch of, one of India's former ruler. But for a lot of people, she's being remembered as the monarch of one of India's closest strategic allies and trading partners, and also someone who's a bit of a global celebrity. You know, when Queen Elizabeth II ascended the throne, India was a young, independent nation. So in many ways, for both the Queen and India, was a bit of a fresh start when it comes to relationship building. And during her reign, we've seen ties between India and the UK become closer when it comes to diplomatic ties and also trading relations. Now, during her time, she came to India 3 times. Remember, she was also the head of the Commonwealth. India is a republic, so never recognized her as the Queen, but is a member of the Commonwealth. The one visit that people are really talking about is her 1997 visit. This is her final visit to India, and it was significant for many reasons. One, it was when India was celebrating 50 years of independence from British rule, and was also a time when she acknowledged one of the most painful chapters in colonial history, the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. In 1919, during a peaceful gathering of protesters, British troops opened fire. British authorities estimate hundreds of people, about 300 to 400 people died, but Indian authorities believe that the death toll was in the thousands. For many of the people then and now, the fact that she visited the site, acknowledged it. She also paid respects to Mahatma Gandhi, a man who fought her father's reign, actually. This was seen as the closest thing India would get to an apology. Over the years, there have been concerted efforts to sort of relook at India's colonial history. There are many symbols that remain. India was a colony for 200 years. Many of the buildings, in fact, the one we're at right now, Connaught Place, this is an important business and shopping district, were built by the British. But many of those buildings, their names have been changed, street names have been changed, buildings have been reconstructed. And for many, her death has reignited conversations about reparations and the impact of colonialism.
Al Jazeera's Pavni Mittal reporting live there from New Delhi. In Westminster Abbey, we're seeing Britain's surviving former prime ministers arriving to take their place ahead of the funeral service. Gordon Brown, Tony Blair, John Major, David Cameron, Boris Johnson there, Theresa May too. Queen Elizabeth was, of course, the head of the Commonwealth, a group of 56 independent nations that include republics. South Africa, of course, one of them. Al Jazeera's Haru Matassa is live for us in Johannesburg. What's the mood there today, Haru?
It's very low-key. Some South Africans are watching the funeral on their TV sets at home or in cafes, but others are not. That could have something to do with maybe the colonial history, the painful history that Britain has with South Africa and other African countries. But those who are remembering her, who are mourning her, are remembering the time she visited this country, like in 1947 as a young girl. She came with her family. That was a time of segregation between the races. And historians say she quietly spoke about how she was unhappy with the way black Africans were being treated in South Africa. For example, they couldn't vote, they were treated badly, they were exploited. And then, of course, after apartheid, she had very good relationships with Nelson Mandela, the first black African president in South Africa. They spoke fondly, they spoke a lot, and she had a close bond with him. Today, the relationship with the monarchy in Britain is that of trade, aid, and diplomacy. Britain's trying to cultivate that relationship, knowing very well that African leaders have trying to build relationships with countries such as India, China, and Russia.
Haru Matassa there, live in Johannesburg. Let's go to another Commonwealth country then, Australia, which has declared a public holiday on Thursday to mark Queen Elizabeth's passing. Sarah Clark is in Sydney. What's the mood there, Sarah?
Well, look, there's been millions of people paying tribute to the Queen here in Sydney at the Opera House. I've seen thousands of people go and look at the amazing images of the Queen being screened across the sails of the Opera House, and they're paying tribute to the long-standing commitment that the Queen had with Australia, mutual admiration. Her first trip was back in 1954, not long after her coronation. 7.5 million people turned out to see her during this trip. It was a 58-day trip. She visited 68 towns and cities. So her commitment was long-standing and widespread. She visited every state and territory in Australia during her 16 trips to this country over her 70-year reign. Now, Australia has a delegation attending the funeral. It's been led by the Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, and included in that delegation, of course, is the Governor-General David Hurley. And he's taken with him a group of recipients who are invited by the Queen. And these are an eclectic mix, including an educational pioneer, a chief medical officer, a long-serving policeman, and the Australian of the Year, Dylan Alcott. So they are there, as well as the Victoria Cross recipients who've been invited to attend by the Queen. Now, I should note that there's been a long-standing debate about whether or not Australia should become a republic. In 1999, you might recall, there was overwhelming support for Australia to stick with the monarchy. So the tributes continue for the Queen here in Australia.
Sarah Clark there, live in Sydney, as Britain's current Prime Minister Liz Truss takes her place inside Westminster Abbey. Let's hand you back to Nick Clark, who's outside the Abbey. Nick.
Yes, the guests keep on coming. Coaches arriving, and as you say, Liz Truss, the British Prime Minister, has just arrived. Interesting because, of course, remember, she was the last Prime Minister that the Queen accepted and anointed as Prime Minister before she died. There was that picture 2 days before she died, in fact, where the Queen is looking frail but has this enigmatic smile as she's greeting Liz Truss. And if you think of it, the Queen herself, she used to like to quote Winston Churchill, who said, "The farther backward you look, the farther forward you can see." And the Queen, her first Prime Minister, was Winston Churchill. He was born in 1874. Liz Truss, who's just walked in here, was born in 1975. It's more than 100 years, that span. It's an extraordinary amount of time, from the time of square-rigged sailing ships to the crazy world that we live in today. Let's bring back Ed Owens, our royal historian. And this is the thing, Ed, isn't it? The Queen sadly takes with her a huge wealth of knowledge to the grave.
Yeah, she does. That's absolutely right. She had accrued vast experience, political knowledge from her interactions, weekly audiences with her prime ministers. And that's something that we are going to lose, that contact with what feels like a distant past, the Second World War, and notably that key figure in modern British history, Winston Churchill.
It's curious, isn't it? You know, how this connection with the British people. This woman of clipped vowels, her jewels and palaces, her headscarf, a million miles from the ordinary people of Britain, and yet everybody somehow had this familial connection with her. Why is that? Why is this outpouring of emotion and affection for the late Queen?
Well, I think there are a couple of reasons which explain Elizabeth II's enduring popularity. As you rightly say, people have often expressed concern about the vast wealth and privilege and power that the members of the British royal family have. And yet, I think three defining legacies, really, of Elizabeth II helped allay and offset concerns within the public about that wealth and privilege. First of all, she emphasised throughout her life this narrative of self-sacrifice, duty and service. People saw her essentially putting the good of the nation, the good of the British public and the Commonwealth ahead of her own personal fulfilment. And that was a powerful narrative which essentially helped conjure this idea that being royal isn't necessarily enviable. It's actually quite a challenging position to inhabit. Secondly, she was, of course, the perfect constitutional monarch, certainly the most perfect example we've had to date, in that she didn't utter a political opinion. She kept her views close to her chest. This meant that people from across the political spectrum could identify with her, no matter their own political views. And finally, I think the longevity of Elizabeth II has been key to her success as monarch. We've already spoken about this intergenerational appeal, but for many people, she was the British monarchy. She was the institution. And in that respect, I think this explains
we're watching these guests. So indeed, as we watch more guests arriving, we've seen Justin Trudeau, the Canadian PM, arrive alongside his wife. I believe Jacinda Ardern, the New Zealand Prime Minister, has arrived as well. And the guests coming thick and fast. We've got another half hour or so until the funeral itself takes place. And just a reminder, the next thing we're expecting to happen is for the state gun carriage to go to Westminster Hall, which is just a short walk away from here. And the Queen's coffin, which, as we all know, has been lying in state since last Wednesday, will be borne onto the gun carriage. And then at, I think it's 10:42 precisely, the local time, the gun carriage will be brought here and to the west door of Westminster Abbey and then taken inside, and then proceedings will get underway. Ed, just coming back to this concept of the Prime Minister's and her political role, which of course was disguised at all times, but nevertheless she did play a very important, she was an important diplomatic tool for the British government.
Absolutely, Elizabeth II was an important diplomatic tool. She exercised soft power. We know that international relations isn't just about military strength, economic strength, technological power. It's also about personality. Having personalities that engage with other heads of state, other foreign diplomats, other foreign leaders is absolutely key. And Elizabeth II was sort of the consummate professional when it came to her role as Britain's #1 chief diplomat. She greased the wheels of diplomacy, and we've heard tributes over the last year. Back at the time of the Platinum Jubilee, President Emmanuel Macron described her as the golden thread that connected the UK and France over the last 70 years. And that despite the fact that recently British and French governments have fallen out. What he was alluding to is the fact that she is the enduring link.
Ed, forgive me, I'm just going to jump in there a second. I just want to explain what we're seeing on our screens right now. I'll be back with you in a second, Ed. So we're looking down the Mall, and that is the King's car on his way. He's just left Buckingham Palace in convoy, en route to the Abbey now, along with the rest of the royal family, and they'll be arriving shortly. It's not a great distance from where he is now to this point here. King Charles, of course, after his mother died, described her as a cherished sovereign and a much-loved mother. We can see, I'm just looking down the street from here, I can see the mass ranks of flashing lights of a big rank of police motorbikes, so I'm sure they'll be with us very soon. That's why we wait for them. In terms of the way Charles has performed in these heady days since his mother